Hello and welcome to another wildlife photography podcast. I was just checking, this is actually podcast 123. So I'm not quite sure how I keep coming up with things, but there you go. So it'd be good to hear from you if you have any questions or anything that you would like me to talk about. So you can email me at Graham, Graham, at ge.photography. So that's the best way to reach me. In this podcast, I thought I'd talk about some frequently asked questions. So these are things that come up pretty regularly when it comes to wildlife photography. So the first one is, how do I get the best wildlife photographs? And there's several aspects to that, so I'm going to go through them one by one. The first thing is, really, once you're there, it's all about patience, because wild animals do their thing. They don't really care about your schedule, what photographs you're trying to get. They're just going to do their thing. So the first thing is to be very patient. And if you are scheduling a trip, make sure that you've allowed lots of time. Excuse me. Now, you may get lucky, and things might happen pretty much straight away. You might see the animal you're looking for. You might get a behavior that you're looking for. It might happen on that very first meeting with the animal, whether it's at sea or on land or wherever. And alternatively, it might not happen at all, or it might be very rare. So in addition to being patient, you really need to be ready as well to just capture that moment. And I say this from experience of doing a lot of whale watching photography. Every now and again, not very often, but I'll be chatting to somebody and I'll turn away from where the whales are and they'll do something really spectacular. And I've just missed it all because I got into conversation. So be very patient, plan for things not to happen, or plan for things to not happen very often, but then also be ready to go. You know, you don't, and a classic one, and I think this is called chimping. I spoke about this in a previous podcast, but when you do get a picture, if something's happening, if you're with animals and they've started doing something, when you take a photograph, don't stop and look at the image on the back of your camera, because that's when you're likely to get something else happening and you've just missed that. And it might even be better than that first photograph you took. So in addition to the patience, be ready to go at any time. So what else do you need to think about in order to get the best photographs? So another important one before you go is to do research. Now, you don't have to do a lot of research, but you need to do the critical stuff. And I would define that as knowing, when are the animals going to be around? When are they likely to be doing the kind of behaviors that you want to photograph? So some animals are migratory. So, and the example I often give is photographing humpback whales off the coast of Sydney in Australia, because I used to do that a lot. So they tend to be going past Sydney around mid to late May up to more or less the end of November. Now, you might get animals outside of those times, but not very far outside either end. And if you want to photograph humpback whales off the coast of Sydney, you definitely don't want to be turning up in March, for example, because there just won't be any. So that's the first thing. Make sure that you are going at the right time of year. And then secondly, do the behaviors you're looking for, or the animals you're looking for, do they tend to be more active or easier to find at certain times of day? Because some animals, for example, lions, they tend to go after prey sort of twilight hours or even at night. During the day, certainly in the heat of the day, they tend to be very inactive. They'll find somewhere shady and go to sleep. So while it might be nice to see them up close like that, sleeping animals don't tend to make very exciting wildlife photographs. So again, time of year, time of day, understand a bit more about the animal or animals that you want to see so that you know when you need to be out there. What else on research? Well, the other thing that I think is useful is to just have a look on something like Instagram or do a Google and just look at other photographers' work. What kind of photographs can you expect to get or hope to get or aim to get? And it's not only a question of the behavior that you're photographing, but also think composition. Look at images, look at atmosphere. You might be aiming for a kind of portrait-y shot of an animal with a very dark background. That might be the kind of thing you're going for. Or you might want to shoot them sort of in context. And what I mean by that is just the animal perhaps slightly smaller in the frame, but so that you can see the sort of area that they live in, so that you can see the environment they're in. And that's what I mean by a context shot. So look at what's around, and it may well give you ideas for the kind of photographs to take. A good thing to do with something like Instagram, for example, is just to do a search on a hashtag. So it might be hashtag tiger or hashtag lions or whatever. But that will throw up a lot of images of that animal. And then you've got a lot to choose from, a lot to look at, and hopefully get some ideas from that. Okay, what else do you need to do? Well, you really need to know your camera. So I'm going to talk about cameras in a moment, but with the camera that you're using, you need to be able to use that camera without really even having to think about what you're doing. So you need to know what mode you're using on the camera. You need to know all the autofocus, have all of that set up properly. You just need to be able to pick it up and shoot and know that the result you're getting is, the key thing is exposure and focus. So you need to have, generally you want the animal sharp and you want good lighting. You want the lighting to be right. So if you know how to do those two things without particularly thinking about it, then that's where you need to be if you're going to do wildlife photography. So as I said before, you need to be ready to go at any moment, and you don't want to be fiddling around with your exposure while things are going on. So one of the things I'll do, particularly if it's early in the day or late in the day when the light levels are changing relatively rapidly, and the thing to be aware of there is that the light might be changing, but your eyes are going to adapt automatically. So your retina will close up or open up as it needs to so that you can see what's going on. The camera won't. So you might, at the start of a shoot, have perfect exposure, but as the sun goes down, you're starting to underexpose more and more. So you need to just make sure you're on top of that and periodically check your exposure, but obviously be very aware of what's going on when you do that. Now, you can recover to a certain extent photographs that are underexposed or overexposed when you get to post-processing, but you always want to start ideally with a perfectly exposed shot, because then you've got a lot more latitude. If you're working with something that's underexposed or overexposed, you are definitely going to be losing aspects of that photograph. Now, it doesn't always kill the photograph. And in fact, you can use that and do maybe more of an arty shot or more atmospheric shot, but it definitely limits your options. So really know your camera and practice a lot so that you're really familiar with it. You know exactly what you're doing. You don't have to think about what to do when your lighting changes. It might be time of day. It might be go from being in an open area to somewhere where there's a lot of trees and the light becomes much more reduced. So you really have to be on top of that. So know your camera. And what I also recommend is that you practice at home. Ideally in the conditions that you're going to be shooting in. So it might be changing light. So just find somewhere where you've got to be changing light and really get good at adapting, changing what you have to on the camera to cope with it, and being able to do that without having to start thinking too much about what you're doing. You need to be able to do these things fast. I do take test shots before we found the animals. So, I mean, more or less the sort of light I'm going to be taking photographs in, but I'll do a test shot before anything's around just to check that the exposure looks right. So I'll look at the little screen on the back of the camera and make sure that things look fine. And then, as I've said, if the light is changing a lot or I have a change of light, I might do a quick test shot if I can, if nothing is going on. But you need to be conscious of that. Now, in terms of practicing, I always recommend that you photograph birds at home because pretty much wherever you live, you're going to find birds unless you're somewhere really remote. And they can be quite tricky to photograph, particularly. So this is where you need to get your autofocus settings correct, because you need to have that camera on that bird. And if you're shooting a bird that's a little distance away, it's quite small in the frame, then you've got an awful lot of stuff which isn't a bird in the frame and a very little bit that is the bird. And what isn't the bird might be sky or it might be buildings. And in fact, if you're shooting a bird against a background or even foreground, but a background that isn't too far away, that means the camera will refocus on the wrong thing if you haven't got your autofocus set up. So practice in those sort of conditions so that you're absolutely sure, and the pictures that you get prove it, that you're on the bird. And if you can do that, then you probably know all you need to know about your autofocus settings. The other thing is, if you're going to be photographing in more extreme conditions, and here I'm thinking more probably temperature is my first thought, but also environment. If it's very dusty or very wet, make sure that you know how to get the most from your camera. So if you're somewhere where it's very cold, you'll probably find that the batteries in the camera, they're not going to be working as efficiently as they will in what for most people is a more comfortable temperature. So just a tip there, something I did something I do when I'm in that sort of environment is I'll have a spare battery, but I'll have it in my clothing so that it's against my skin or close to, so that it's basically my body heat is warm, keeping the battery at a reasonable temperature. So it doesn't have to be really hot, but it just needs to be not freezing, basically. And then when I can, again, know how to switch batteries. If you've got a spare, I ideally have a spare in that situation, and be able to change them fairly quickly. But then you've got a battery that's at nice temperature. It'll work pretty efficiently until it cools off. If you don't have a spare, then think about how you can keep the camera itself close to you, or at least reasonably warm, so that you get as much battery life out of a charge when you're taking your photographs. If you don't do that, what you may well find is that the battery just runs out of steam and suddenly you've got a camera that is pretty much dead and you can't get those photographs. So think about that and how you're going to handle that. If you're somewhere where it's very hot, probably less of an issue for the battery, but you do want to try and keep the camera cool. And a lot of cameras are black, so they'll tend to absorb heat. So I try and keep my camera in a bag, or I'll use a spray cover. So that's something that I bought for using the camera at sea. So it's a cover, and the one I've got is designed for a long telephoto because that's what I tend to use. So I use a 100 to 400mm zoom, and it's got an elastic opening at one end which goes over the lens opening. So I normally have that at the lens, and then it will cover the whole camera. And you've got a little hole there so you can look through the viewfinder or look at the LCD on the back. But what that does, it works well for keeping spray off the camera. It also works well in a dusty environment. In fact, I've probably used it more in dusty environments than I have at sea. And to some extent, it provides some shading on the camera if it's a lighter color, so it will reflect more. Obviously, the problem you have is you don't want it white, because if you're in an environment where you're looking at land animals particularly, and if you're walking, you sort of want to blend in, and you don't want to be, it's like walking along blowing a trumpet if you've got something that's really bright on your camera, or all your clothing is like that. So it's about finding the trade-off that works, but have a think about how you're going to handle those conditions if that is applicable to where you're going. Okay, so another thing I'm going to talk about, let's talk about the images you're going to, or the pictures you're going to come back with first. So I've already said, have a look around, get ideas, and ideally you want a shoot list of sorts in the back of your mind. Now, I say of sorts because your shoot list, I think of when I was doing portrait shooting. So I'd have like family shoot list, I'd have a one-on-one shoot list, and these are just different shots that I want to get while I'm photographing that person. And I would have two usually. There'd be a general list I'd work off, and then the actual client list, which would be the things that they request, plus the things I've highlighted in my regular list. So that sort of thing. As I said, wildlife isn't terribly cooperative when it comes to working your way through a shoot list. So the thing to do is have ideas of the kind of shot that you'd like to get. And just be aware that you may or may not get the opportunity to get those shots, but they may give you ideas while you're there that you can just improvise something or just try a different composition or a close-up. Or I've already spoken about backgrounds. There's depth of field, obviously, is a key one, depending on what it is you're actually shooting. So think through those things and at least have some ideas about what you want to shoot. Now, I've been doing this a while, so I tend to, I'm in a situation, I'll kind of look what's there and that'll give me ideas. But somewhere in the back of my head, I do have the kind of shots that I like to get. So I like to do what I refer to as a context shot. So it shows the environment that the animal is in, so that somebody who isn't familiar with the animal, when they look at your photographs, they can then get an idea of the kind of environment that you're in to take them. And also, I love to get close-ups because for me, a good wildlife photograph is a photograph or a view of an animal that you wouldn't normally get. Sometimes it's about getting close. Sometimes it's freezing a moment. It might be, say, a snake striking. Not that I'm particularly fond of snakes, but you get the idea. It's just something you freeze in time that when you're just looking at it, happens so fast, you don't really see what's going on. A whale breaching is another example of that. That's a bit slower, but even so, it's great to just capture that moment and freeze it in time. So I'll shoot as fast as I can so that I'm freezing water droplets coming off the animal as it's doing that. So have a think about the kind of photograph you want to come back with. Now, so I'm going to come to lighting. So flash is a question that sometimes comes up. I never shoot flash with animals, and I think there are, I can't think of any wildlife photographers who do, or even the circumstance where you would do that. Because what you're doing, if you're using flash, it's because you've got a low light situation. And even if you're using it as a fill-in flash, as for bright light, you've got to be close to the animal, and basically you're exposing it to a very bright light, which is a bit of a surprise at best, and quite a shock at worst. And you're likely to get some sort of reaction from the animal, and it's not a nice thing to do, because animals in their natural environment aren't exposed to flash photography very often, or hopefully at all. So and again, coming back to what you're doing with wildlife photography, for me, it's about trying to capture the animal in its natural environment, doing the things it normally does, and trying to catch some aspect of the personality of the animal. In fact, this is something that I'm feeling more strongly about as time goes on, because what we're gradually discovering is that a lot of animals are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. They're not just dumb creatures wandering about and doing things on instinct. There are definite signs of intelligence. There's language in the way they communicate, pretty basic language, but it's there, the way animals communicate, whether it's alarm calls, or social interactions, which we're becoming more and more aware of in mammals particularly, which obviously some of them have been known for some time, but others are relatively recent understandings. And even in Asian elephants, something I shared with my Patreon group a while back now, is Asian elephants have been discovered where they partially bury dead animals. Now, that to me is pretty mind-blowing, because that indicates some level of intelligence that goes beyond simply day-to-day, very simple existence, like identifying a tree or something you can eat. This is something more. There's another level of intelligence going on there. So for me, and this is what I used to do in portraits, I would try and capture something of that person, that when you looked at that portrait, you felt connected to them in some way. And my approach to animal photography, wildlife photography, is exactly the same. Ideally, you get some connection with that animal. Okay, so, right, I was talking about flash. I also want to talk about the best times to photograph animals. Now, obviously, when they do things is going to dictate best times to some degree. From a photography point of view, there are a couple of parts of the day that are relevant. So what do I mean by that? I'm thinking about creating atmospheric shots. So what the worst time to take a photograph of an animal is middle of the day. So you've got very harsh lighting, very strong shadows. You'll burn out a lot of detail when you get to the actual photograph itself. It takes a lot of work on Photoshop, whatever you're using, to bring details back in and still have a balanced photograph. And I tend not to do that, to be honest. So the best times tend to be golden hour, which is pretty well known. And that's the hour immediately after sunrise, so when the sun has come above is breaking the horizon, basically. That's the beginning of golden hour. And then the other golden hour, because there's two of them, is the hour before sunset, so while the sun is still in the sky. Because as the sun gets lower at sunset and higher at sunrise, you get these beautiful orangey colors. So they are very atmospheric. And also, if you are up early and they're at sunrise, often you'll get mist happening and those kind of things. And if you're lucky enough to get an animal in those sort of conditions, in the orange light, the yellowy orange light, they can be really special photographs. So sunrise and sunset, definitely great times. The animal doesn't even have to be doing much, except maybe standing. And you can get really amazing photographs, and then you want to think about composition and how you're going to put that together. The other time that probably less useful because the lighting is trickier, but it's blue hour. So blue hour, there are two of those as well. So blue hour at sunset is the hour after the sun itself is not visible on the horizon. So it's when just dipping, it's just gone below the horizon, but you get the sky is still lit, you can still see things. And that also is very atmospheric. And again, the same thing at sunrise. It's that hour before the sun breaks the horizon. So it's like that pre-dawn glow that you get. And if there are animals about and you're in the right space, that's a time to get really atmospheric photographs. But obviously, these things really hit and miss. So these are shots that you're going to be pretty lucky to get. But your luck improves when you practice a lot and you know how to work in low light, and you get yourself in a position where you have a good chance of seeing an animal in those conditions. So all of those things are important to think about. Okay, the final thing I'm going to talk about is the camera itself. So chances are you've already got the camera gear, and that's fine. And so I've already said, the important thing is to get familiar with it and get really good at using it in all of these conditions and situations that you're likely to be shooting in. However, it's also possible that you're in a position where you're thinking about what camera to get, and you may well have the misunderstanding, let's call it that wildlife photographers have to have really top-end camera gear. Now, it's certainly true that if you've got fast lenses, so lenses with a very wide aperture, basically a very wide lens, they let in a lot of light. That gives you a lot of flexibility. If you've got camera gear that gives you high burst speeds and very fast shutter speeds, those are absolutely brilliant for capturing action. But having said all of that, if you understand the basics of photography, and by that I mean really the exposure triangle, the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and sensitivity, ISO, and how to just get the most from your camera, so how to get a fast shutter speed, and those sort of things you have to do. You don't really need high-end equipment. Yes, if you've got high-end, you're going to get good quality photographs. But the most important part of any camera system, to use the old phrase, is the 6 inches or whatever it is behind the viewfinder. So it's basically you and your ability to get the best from the equipment you have. And if you can't afford the best gear, it doesn't matter. That's not so important. Look, I recommend anything where you can change the lens. So I have a couple of DSLRs that I use. In fact, they're not the top end. They're Canon. But they are reasonably expensive, having said that, or one of them is. That's my EOS 5DS, but I also use an EOS 7D Mark II. That is a relatively kind of mid-range. We're still talking over $1,000 for one of those. So it could be too expensive. But if you come down a little bit in the more consumer area, the body itself, as long as it gives you fast shutter speed, a reasonable burst speed, what's reasonable, I don't know, 3 to 7 frames a second, which most of them will do. If again, it comes back to what are you photographing? If you've got 3 images in a second, how fast is what you're shooting moving? And that will answer whether that's fast enough for you. In most cases, you don't even need that speed. It's just when something's happening that might be handy. It certainly is for humpback whales breaching. So I would want a minimum of 3 frames a second and probably be able to shoot around definitely 1/1000th of a second or faster. I'll sometimes go up to 1/4000th of a second. But that's to capture something in a situation where it's not only the animal that's moving, but I'm on a boat, so that's moving. And also what usually happens with whales coming out of the water is you're very lucky. If you're really experienced, you might get there, but there's definitely a degree of luck in there as well. You might be pointing exactly at where the animal's coming up out of the water. And I have had that a few times, but most of the times I do breaches, I've had to pivot to get the animal in frame. And I'm firing while I do that. My camera is down on that shutter button, I hold it down. That to me is a reasonably extreme situation. Certainly if you're going on a safari, even if you've got an animal, a predator running down a prey animal, 3 frames a second is fine for that. Things don't happen that quickly, and frankly, you're probably not going to see that much anyway. And what's the shot you want to get? If you've got a sequence of one animal chasing another, closing, and then bringing it down, that's generally what you will see. So all of this, what I'm saying is it all comes back to what is it you want to photograph, what are the ideal images you want to come out with. And you will find that as long as you have a reasonable quality consumer type camera, that is going to be perfect. The other thing is to make sure you've got good quality lenses. So to me, the lens is probably the more important part of the camera setup. And my lenses I've had for much longer than I've had the bodies. So that is true. It's a bit like I don't know if you're into audio and hi-fi. It was always the speakers were the thing that were worth putting the money into, because most of the rest of a hi-fi system is reasonable quality anyway, but the speakers will make all the difference to the final sound that you hear. And it's the same with a camera setup. If you're going to put money into anything, buy good quality lenses. Again, excuse me, they don't have to be really expensive. I recommend zoom lenses as well. And automatic with the zoom lens, you drop off quality because you can't get the big apertures. If you want absolutely the best images, you want nice big apertures, but they tend to be a fixed focal length. And that in itself is a limitation. You're probably looking at multiple lenses, multiple bodies to have the options you want. So look, my recommendation is get a decent quality zoom lens, and that will, in most circumstances, give you a good result, certainly a good enough result. If you know how to get the most from your camera, if you know how to get the best exposure, get a correct exposure, you understand how to use the shutter speed and how all that works, then those things together, there's no reason I can think of why you wouldn't get a good result. So that's pretty much it. So I guess just to recap, be patient, be ready to go any moment, do your research, practice a lot, look and particularly with the research, look at the kind of images you want and make sure you understand how the photographer achieved that result, because you need to know what sort of settings they were using. You don't have to know precisely, but you need to know just roughly. Know things like shutter speed, depth of field, all that kind of stuff. Be on top of your composition, have composition ideas. Think about lighting. Are the golden hour and blue hours, are they the best times for you? When is the animal going to be there? Time of year, time of day. No flash. Always shoot raw. I didn't mention that, but I always shoot raw. The only time I wouldn't is if you're only ever going to use those images on social media, in which case you can shoot in a JPEG, but I never do that, because even if you're doing that, you might get a shot that you really love and you want to blow it up, put it on a wall, and maybe make a photo book. And often with JPEGs, they just don't look. Once the JPEG compresses, it leaves a lot of detail. And I've looked at photo books, and I know they've been shot in JPEG, and the quality is just not the same as an image that was originally shot in RAW and then processed. So do shoot RAW. And then when it comes to the camera, if you've got your own camera, then great. If you're thinking about buying something, a bit of kit, then maybe look at a lens. Again, it depends how far away you're going to be from the animal. If you can get in close, then you might want a short wide angle zoom. Maybe even a macro, so you can focus really closely. Depends on what you're photographing. More often with the wildlife I do, I've used my 100-400 lens from Canon, and that has given me some really good results. So I'm very pleased with that. Okay, so hopefully that's useful. And if you are going away and going to do some wildlife photography, good luck. Hope you have a fantastic time. And I'll speak to you again in the next podcast. So bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.